Who's got a
Right.
Who's got a growler? Who's growling? I'm just curious. I don't think it's my cave claw. Andang, are you growling?
I am not Trish.
By the way,
Is that my
just to
fault?
let you know, Wigan, I did ask Braxwolf if he would go ahead and tape because he did such a nice job taping last week.
Oh, okay. Great.
And so I said, let's do it. And whether we use it or not, I don't know, but he does a really nice job taping, so we could
Great.
always, put it up somewhere, maybe on the site or something.
You actually have permission this time.
Yes. Silly boy. Okay. All right. So I'm thinking what we probably ought to, I think we're done with what we're doing. We'll just keep adding people if they show, and we can figure out fellowships once we get to West Bree. So rather than try and do it here, we'll let you do your talking thing.
Good. All right. Well, then I want to do a little bit of talking, which is mainly I want to talk about the Barrow Downs, because that's where I want to go tonight. So the two reasons I want to do the Barrow Downs are that I've only done part of the Barrow Downs, and of course that bothers me on its own because I hate only doing part of things. But in addition, it's one of the things, as I have gone through the game the first time, just kind of looking around and not knowing what I was doing. There have been a lot of portions, of regions and things that I haven't really explored thoroughly, and don't really feel like I have a really good sense of the full sort of story and plot line of. So I want to go through the Barrow Downs a little bit more thoroughly. And in particular, I've never been inside the Great Barrow at all, even once. So I definitely want to go. I want to do the Great Barrow and look at how those instances are put together and the kind of storyline of the Great Barrow quests, and thinking about them in relationship to the way the rest of the Barrow Downs are depicted. So as far as like my in-game exploration / questing goals, that's what I really want to do tonight. So I thought we'd just sort of start for a couple minutes with sort of some sort of general discussion about Barrow Whites and the Barrow Downs. Does anybody have any sort of questions or discussion topics? Are there things that anyone would particularly like to know about the Barrow Downs, or questions that they had about Barrows of the Barrow Downs?
Sure, I have a
All
question.
right.
Sure, Brandon.
So, where does the White come from? He seems to be some powerful creature. Where does he come from?
Well, the main thing about the Barrow Downs is that the main thing about the Barrow Whites. The main thing to remember about the Barrow Whites is that they're not the spontaneously risen dead. They're not really animated bodies of the dead. That is, they're not the dead brought back to life. They are evil spirits who are brought in order to animate, in order to live in those barrows. And it's interesting because, and I think in particular of the way in which the scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring are depicted, and in especial the song that Tom Bombadil sings when he comes and rescues them. He suggests that we're told that the Barrow Whites are envious of the living, and that seems to be true. Like if you look at the incantation that the Barrow White says over the hobbits in the Barrow, what he's doing is he's trying to make them like him. He's trying to sort of assimilate them, and he's essentially cursing them to be like to the cold and darkness that he himself is doomed to. But it was clear that the Barrow Whites started off as essentially a sort of a strategic thing from the Witch King. These were evil spirits who were sent to live in these barrows, and it was part of like the Witch King's plan to sort of like invade and infect all of the Northlands. So like they were not spontaneous, nor were they like the Oathbreakers in the South. The result of sort of enduring as the consequence of their own sins, their own faults. But as I say, they were they were definitely something that was made, sent to do what they were doing and made to be what they were. Where the Barrow Whites came from in Tolkien's mind, like in Tolkien's writing, I find really interesting. I thought I would read a short passage. The introduction to the Barrow Whites. That is the first place we ever meet Barrow Whites in Tolkien's writings. Trivia question. Does anybody know where that is? Where we first encounter Barrow Whites? Where Tolkien first introduces Barrow Whites?
It's in a poem. It's in a poem.
Yeah, wasn't it in a poem with like a badger or something like that?
Exactly. It's right after the badger incident.
Right after the badger. That was right. It was a Tom Bombadil poem.
It is. It's in the original Adventures of Tom Bombadil poem that was published in the early 30s, and which of course is where the character of Tom Bombadil comes from. And as you can hear from the original poem, it's always where. It's also where Tom Bombadil's poetic diction comes from. Tom Bombadil in Fellowship of the Ring still speaks in the same poetic meter that the original poem was in. But in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, of course, Tom has encounters with Goldberry, who pulls him into the river and tries to drown him. And then with Old Man Willow and with the family of badgers, and then with the Barrow White. And I would urge you to pay particular attention to try to figure out what the Barrow White is. This is the first time we're introduced to it, and we're given it here totally stripped of any historical circumstance, right? So we've got no reference to Angmar, no reference to anything else. It's just a Barrow White who shows up at Tom Bombadil's bedroom door one evening. So look at the way it's described. Trying to figure out what this thing is exactly is sort of a little bit tricky. So okay, let's see. So Tom is he unlocks his door and he goes in and he lights a lamp in the kitchen. Then we have dark came under hill. Tom, he lit a candle. Upstairs creaking went, turned the door handle. Who, Tom Bombadil, look what night has brought you. I'm here behind the door. Now at last I've caught you. You'd forgotten Barrow White, dwelling in the old mound, up there on hilltop with a ring of stones round. He's got loose again. Under earth he'll take you. Poor Tom Bombadil, pale and cold he'll make you. So you see this idea of the Barrow White wanting to bring him into his barrow and make him cold and pale like himself. It goes all the way back to the beginning. And of course Tom's response, go out, shut the door, and never come back after. Take away gleaming eyes, take your hollow laughter. Go back to grassy mound, on your stony pillow. Lay down your bony head, like old man Willow, yet like young Goldberry and badger folk in Burrow. Go back to buried gold and forgotten sorrow. Out fled Barrow White, through the window leaping, through the yard, over wall, like a shadow sweeping. Uphill wailing went, back to leaning stone rings, back under lonely mound, rattling his bone rings. Now, of course, when he says, lay down your bony head like old man Willow and Goldberry and badger folk in Burrow, he's not saying that he's condemning the Barrow White to exactly the same fate that he condemned the others. Here he's just referring to the fact that earlier on in the poem, all of his encounters end with Tom Bombadil basically commanding them to go to sleep, and they go to sleep. So he's basically putting the Barrow White back to bed. He's saying, go back home and lay your head down on the pillow. But notice the descriptions that we get of the Barrow White. We're told at the beginning that he has gleaming eyes and hollow laughter. That's so he himself suggests that he is pale and cold, and he's going to make Tom Bombadil pale and cold. Tom says that he has gleaming eyes and hollow laughter. He tells him to lay his bony head on the stony pillow, so it sounds like he's a skeleton, and he's rattling his bone rings at the very end. So that seems to be, but at the same time, when he leaps through the window and goes through the yard and over the wall, he's like a shadow sweeping. So he's not just like a walking skeleton. it seems, either. So we have him being like a shadow, but also being associated with bone. I think he is sort of primarily kind of skeletal in his description. Now, what is the Barrow White exactly? He does sound like the animated dead in this poem. It's hard to say because he doesn't say exactly, but certainly the whole, spirits sent by the shadow of Angmar doesn't really seem to be it obviously is nowhere near the picture. He seems to be sort of spontaneously there. Brandon, go ahead and make that comment aloud.
Reading it, it's almost like the Barrow White sealed away how that Tom had some away, and then the Barrow escaped and sealing by some magic, that's called.
Yeah, it does seem like he sort of like he has escaped. I mean, at the beginning, I find it really interesting that it starts that his words to Tom Bombadil start by saying, "I'm here behind the door. Now at last I've caught you. You'd forgotten Barrow White, dwelling in the old mound." And now at last I've caught you makes it sound like he's been stalking him for a really long time, right? That I think is kind of interesting. But yeah, it does sound like he's escaped, and that Tom is sending him back again. Notice, of course, this is the opposite of what Tom does in the Fellowship of the Ring, right? Tom Bombadil banishes him, drives him out of the mound, and sends him off into the darkness. Far beyond the darkness, in fact, and commands him never to come again. So again, we certainly see Tom's reaction is quite different. But again, that's much more in keeping with the spirit of the poem, where Tom doesn't really disturb anything. I mean, he asserts his authority, but he just calms everybody down, right? When people get uppity, like when Goldberry pulls him into the water and Old Man Willow dumps him on his side, and it's pretty clear from the context of the poem, at least I think it's pretty clear from the conversation between Old Man Willow and Tom Bombadil, that they seem to be, like buddies. I mean, they're not exactly enemies, and Old Man Willow isn't all that scary. But anyway, it's, with the Barrow White, it's a little bit different. That sense of like, that he's been waiting for a long time and has caught him at last, but even then, Tom Bombadil doesn't destroy him, and doesn't banish him or send him away. He just sends him back to be quiet again in his barrow. So I think, again, that's certainly very different from what we get in the Fellowship of the Ring, but I think that's a really interesting sort of shift in the identity of the Barrow Whites as time goes by. Anyway, I'm in light of the descriptions that we get, and those descriptive details that we get in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil are really more than we get in any in the Fellowship of the Ring. We get very little physical description of the Whites in the Barrow Whites in the Fellowship of the Ring. In fact, the only thing of which we do get a clear description is the creeping hand, right? Which is why I laughed the first time I saw the creeping hands in LOTRO, because I was like, awesome! Look at they totally nailed the creeping hand. That's exactly right. Especially the fact that it's actually attached to an arm, right? It's not like the hand in the Addams Family, right? Walking by itself. It's attached to an arm because, of course, there has to be enough arm there for Frodo to cut the hand off at the wrist, which is what he does in the Barrow, you remember. So that was one thing. Like, as soon as I saw my first creeping hand in LOTRO, I was like, oh, serious bonus points right there. That's pretty good. The most textually grounded character in the Barrow Downs is clearly the creeping hand. Anyway, I was, but looking at the Whites themselves, looking at the primary way in which the Barrow Whites are depicted, you can see they're both skeletal and ghostly, right? They're not simply skeletons walking around, but they're definitely skeletal. It seems to me that there's a some pretty careful reading behind the way that they've actually visually depicted the Barrow Whites in the game. Yeah, Chris, go ahead. Do you want to make that comment out?
Sure. I'm just talking about what they could possibly be. It almost, in a way, implies that they're human spirits.
Right.
But I could never get particularly after reading the Silmarillion, it seems like that kind of violates the men's destinies being beyond the circles of the world. Could Sauron or the Witch King or evil hold human spirits and trap them on Earth to use them as Barrow Whites? Or are these maybe elvish spirits or Mire spirits that have been corrupted? I don't know. It's just something I've thought about off and on.
Yeah, well, it is a good question. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, as far as the Barrow Whites, you're right. It doesn't seem to fit into a lot of the Middle Earth folklore that we know. This one is the one that seems most grounded in the British myths and legends that Tolkien would have grown up with,
yes.
Particularly to the Bronze Age burial mounds that dot the country and the standing stones that are all over the place.
That's right.
If anyone's ever been to England and seen Avesbury Hill, it's a gigantic burial mound that is taller than some of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. And well, I'm foothills anyway. I might be exaggerating there. Everything's big when you're 12, but but the Barrow Whites themselves seem to ground with a lot of the folklore about, don't go to those places after dark. They've been around since the Romans, were out there. Probably before the Romans, there were rumors about these Bronze Age, Stone Age, ancient hills that nobody knew how they were there anymore. We know more about it now, but even in Tolkien's day, there was so little that we knew about Bronze Age and Stone Age men, that these were kind of scary, wild, pagan men that we didn't know much about. So it might be that these men sort of almost, predate the Tolkien men as we know. They sort of have their own ancient history that's sort of shrouded in mystery. And
absolutely.
And keeps them sort of these wild pagans that don't share the destiny of man.
Yeah, and that idea is something that he, exactly as you were saying, that idea of like the unknown prehistoric men that predate the Romans, is that same concept is there in the Lord of the Rings. That the people who were buried in there were some of the Númenóreans, some of the Dúnedain, who were buried there. But it's also suggested that many of the Barrows, long predated those. So yeah, there's this sense even there that like even before the Númenóreans came and established Arnor, these like the Bronze Age and Stone Age cultures in England, these Barrows had still been there even before the Númenóreans came. So yeah, there is that, and like what you're saying, the Adventures of Tom Bombadil as a poem is very much connected with that tradition. Goldberry herself is very much a character out of English popular folklore. There were a number of sort of local fairy spirits who were supposed to inhabit rivers and bodies of water, who liked to drown children. If your child goes alone by the river, you've got to be careful because Jenny Greenteeth might leap out of the water and pull it down and drown it.
Somebody needs to mute themselves. Is there a TV
Steve,
going on in the background?
Who's she afraid of?
I think, yeah.
Who's afraid of her?
Yep.
There we go.
Steve, that was you, Steve Shaper there. Anyway, yeah. So again, Goldberry comes from that tradition as well. So, and of course, Goldberry ends up in the Fellowship of the Ring having a somewhat higher destiny than old Jenny Greenteeth. But we do see a lot of those old, even willow trees. Willow trees too, in fairy and folklore tradition, were supposed to like sneak up behind you and grab you. That's so yeah. I mean, I don't know. My my knowledge of English folklore concerning badgers is a little weak, but who knows? Maybe badgers have some kind of sinister reputation with which I'm not familiar. But it definitely does come from that direction.
The badger sort of shows up as this Oscar the Grouch character in a lot of fairy, especially the very twee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just again, like we see that echoed in The Wind in the Willows, right? With the irascible badger, who lives by himself in the woods. Good. And so I think someone else was trying to jump in there, I think.
Well, this is Luanori, and it's been a while since I read Lord of the Rings or the appendices. And maybe this is just something that I inferred. Maybe I didn't actually read it anywhere, but I was under the impression that the Barrow Downs were kind of part of a network of burial mounds that included like old dead kings and lords from Anuminus and Fornost and stuff like that. And he never wrote this down, but I always got the feeling, especially in the Fellowship of the Ring, that the appearance of the Barrow Whites, it seemed to me to be just like another way that Sauron's influence had grown so long that he was starting to disturb the remains of the dead. And I think that might have just been my young imagination, working when I had first read these books. But now that you've illuminated me as far as the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, and that these were tales that had predated the Lord of the Rings, that probably just blows that theory to dust. But that was always my impression.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I think, one thing, and again, this is something that I think that in general LOTRO's done really well, is the idea, though, of course, LOTRO, since they go so much further beyond the geographical boundaries of the plot of the Lord of the Rings, right, which never really goes further north than the East Road, but nevertheless, there's the idea implanted there that evil things are stirring again, that old evils that have been thought long put to rest and that haven't been heard from are now stirring once more. So the idea that, the Barrow Whites and the Barrow Downs are like becoming more active now as a result of Sauron stirring, I think you're right, that's not explicitly said, but I think it's possible to read that. We get the references. I'm thinking in particular here of the references at the end well, actually, it's not the end of chapter 1. I think it's the beginning of chapter 2. It's right when we're getting the 17 years of time passing between Bilbo's departure and Gandalf's return in the beginning of his conversation with Frodo in the Shadows of the Past. When we hear about the passing of those 17 years, and Tolkien's talking about what Frodo was doing, and how he used to spend a lot of time talking to wayfarers who came through the Shire, who all had stories to tell about how dark things were getting, and how now they're finding trolls, terrible and armed with terrible weapons, and all of those things. So we do get that sense that evil things are stirring again. So it does seem to me quite possible, quite likely, that basically one of the reasons that Frodo and that Frodo and company fall prey to the Barrow Whites as sort of quickly and thoroughly as they do is not just because they were really pretty dumb to stop for a prolonged lunch break in the Barrow Downs, but also because the Barrow Whites were already stirring and actually lying in wait. That seems to me very plausible. It's not definite. It's not explicitly said, but it does seem to me a very plausible reading.
Thing I noted with the Barrow Whites and stuff, talking about evil creatures rising, the Barrow White is the only evil creature that I think is not inherent onto the Frodo's the only one who can get away from the Barrow White. So, just an thought I had.
Yeah, so you're breaking up a little bit there, but you're saying about the relationship with the ring. I missed that part there in the middle.
So the Barrow White seems to be the only evil creature not attracted to the ring.
Right.
Able to escape almost.
Yeah, that you're right. That is interesting. That they don't respond, and you'd think they would, right? I mean, they seem like the Nazgul. I mean, obviously they don't have rings of power like the Nazgul, but they seem like the Nazgul in being, at least like partially in the spirit world, that kind of. You'd think that they might have some perception of the ring, but you're right. There isn't any evidence of that unless you want to take the fact that all of them are captured and pass out. Frodo is set apart, right? He's not in this. There's Frodo and Merry and Pippin, all laid out with a naked sword across their throats, and Frodo is separate from them. There's no real sense, I think. There's no obvious excuse for that. We're not told why Frodo has been apparently treated differently. I wonder if he's been set aside because they do sense that there's something different about him. But that's really very indirect evidence and nothing really clear at all. You're right, certainly, in the song that they get, we don't get any sense that they have any idea that they've, captured somebody important or, done something significant by capturing the ring. It does seem to be completely off their radar screen, which is kind of interesting. Oh, Robert, thank you. I can always trust Robert to fact check me here. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so it's one of those, they might have set him apart because he was the oldest of the party, or they might have set him aside because, I think, given his lineage, he might have had fairer hair than the others, so it might have been any other reason they set him aside.
It's possible. Yeah. Though, lineage-wise, he and
Merry.
Pippin, certainly. I mean, Pippin is at least as blue-blooded as Frodo is, if not more. But anyway, I was just saying, Robert Brown, and I assume, Robert, are you non-micable as you were before? Are you text only again tonight, Robert? Yeah. Okay. Well, so Robert was pointing out that in the Hunt for the Ring in Unfinished Tales, he does mention explicitly that the Witch King goes to stir up the Barrow Whites when he's in the hood there. Thanks, Robert, for reminding us of that and confirming the theories that we're talking about. So, cool. Aaron, did you have something else you wanted to add?
Oh, just quickly, that it may be that Frodo being set aside could be just the subtle influence of the ring. I mean, as the ring's influence on Frodo gradually gets stronger, I think that because the ring is in a new owner's hands, that its influence on other creatures gradually gets stronger as well. So they may not even understand why they're setting him aside, but they kind of feel the impulse to do so because of the vague influence of this dark thing in their presence, but they're not yet explicitly aware of what it is.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of the sense that I get. Again, we don't have any evidence from anything they say that he's actively thinking about the ring or aware of it. But the fact that Frodo is treated differently does suggest to me exactly that kind of thing. That they can, in some sense, just sense the fact that he's different, that he's in a different sort of place from them. Anyway, good. Well, I don't want to just lecture at you all night about the Barrow Whites, but I thought we could have a little context here to sort of talk a little bit about Tolkien's treatment of the Barrow Whites and where they came from in Tolkien's mind, and then so we can all be kind of thinking about that a little bit as we go through. And of course, you're right. Robert, of course, was reminding me that I've been in the Great Barrow in Book 1. Yeah, but that didn't count. I mean, I haven't done the Great Barrow instances, is what I mean. Yeah. I mean, like I did enjoy being rescued by Tom Bombadil, though I have to say the effect of Tom Bombadil's rescue in that Book 1 epic quest chain isn't anything like the same that it is in the book. Mostly because every single time, and I've done that twice now, and each time that I do it, my reaction instead of like, you know, having this eucatastrophe reaction like Frodo does, my reaction is always, dude, I had this. Like I was just about to destroy him. You know, Tom, I didn't need you. Which is really just not quite the same as Frodo's reaction at that moment. But anyway, so yes, technically I've been inside the Great Barrow, but I've never done the instances, and I'm interested to.